In 1972, a woman named Carol Whitfield stood in a crowd outside a concert venue in Cincinnati, Ohio, and took a photograph. She was 23 years old. She had driven 4 hours from her mother's house in Kentucky to see the Jackson 5, and she had arrived 2 hours before the doors opened because she had read in a magazine that the group sometimes came out to the parking lot before shows to meet the fans who had been waiting the longest. The photograph she took was not remarkable by the standards of 1972 concert photography. It was slightly overexposed, taken with a Kodak Instamatic on a cloudy afternoon. It showed a boy of 14, Michael Jackson, standing near the rear entrance of the venue in a winter coat that was slightly too large for him, speaking to a woman who appears, in the frame, to be someone's mother. He is not performing. He is not smiling for a camera. He does not appear to know he is being photographed. Carol Whitfield kept the photograph for 52 years. He had been 14 years old and the biggest young pop star in America. He had, by that point, had 4 #1 singles and 2 albums, and had appeared on more television programs than Carol could count. He was, by any external measure, famous, genuinely, completely famous, in the specific way that the Jackson 5 were famous in the early 1970s, which was different from the way most performers were famous because it reached the specific demographic of young black America in a way that mainstream pop had rarely managed before. He was very famous, and he was 14 years old, and he was standing in a parking lot in Cincinnati in a coat that was too large for him, talking to a woman who appeared to be asking him something about his family. The reason Carol Whitfield kept the photograph was not because it documented something extraordinary. It was because it documented something she had not expected. The Jackson 5 in 1972 were not simply a pop group. They were, in the specific cultural economy of that moment, something that the American entertainment industry had not quite produced before. A black family act that had crossed into the mainstream not by accommodating the mainstream's aesthetic preferences, but by being too good to be accommodated any other way. Motown had built them carefully, had understood exactly what it was launching when it signed them in 1969. But the thing that made them work, the specific, unteachable thing that made Michael Jackson something the industry could not manufacture from scratch, was not the production. It was the person. At 12, at 13, at 14, Michael Jackson had a quality that no rehearsal produced and no arrangement enhanced. He had, in the specific language of people who understand performance from the inside, the thing that a performer either has or does not have. The thing that cameras cannot create and audiences cannot be taught to feel. In the decades that followed, as Michael Jackson became the best-selling recording artist in history, as Thriller and Bad and Dangerous and the History album each redefined what a pop career could be, as the world's relationship with Michael Jackson went through every form of devotion and scrutiny and spectacle that the 20th century's entertainment culture could produce, through all of it, Carol Whitfield had this one photograph, a blurry Instamatic shot from a parking lot in Cincinnati, a boy in a coat that was too large for him, an afternoon in 1972 that lasted about 5 minutes, and that Carol could still recall in specific sensory detail more than 50 years later. The gray of the Ohio sky, the sound of someone shouting Michael's name from the stage door, the way he turned toward the sound and then turned back. She did not tell many people about it. It was not a dramatic story by the standards of the stories people tell about meeting famous musicians. She had not received an autograph. She had not spoken to Michael directly. The conversation she watched from 20 feet away had been between Michael and the other woman, and Carol had been on the edge of the small group that had gathered when it became clear that the boy from the Jacksons was actually out there, actually in the parking lot, actually doing what the magazine had said he sometimes did. What Carol kept for 52 years was not really the photograph. It was the 5 minutes she had spent watching Michael Jackson talk to that other woman in the parking lot of a concert venue in Cincinnati on a cloudy afternoon in 1972. This was surprising to Carol Whitfield in a way that she could not have predicted in advance. She had not, before that afternoon, thought very carefully about the difference between a performer and a person. She had thought about Michael Jackson the way most people thought about famous performers in 1972, as a category of person that was different from ordinary persons, that existed primarily in the space where they were visible. That was what they appeared to be. The fact that there was something behind the appearance, a specific person, a specific 14-year-old, wearing a coat that was too large for him, and actually listening to what someone in a parking lot was saying to him, had not been something she had fully considered. The photograph she took was blurry at the edges. Michael was slightly off-center in the frame. The overexposure made the coat look almost white against the gray Ohio sky. It was not a good photograph by any technical standard. She kept it in a shoebox for 20 years, then in a photo album for another 15, then in a plastic sleeve in a filing cabinet drawer for the rest of the time. She showed it to her daughter in 1995, when her daughter was old enough to understand who Michael Jackson was. She told her daughter about the parking lot, about the coat, about the way Michael had turned back to finish what he was saying before he left. Her daughter looked at the photograph for a long time. She asked her mother, "Did you tell him you were there?" Carol said, "No, I didn't want to interrupt." She had expected, in the specific way that young people who go to see famous musicians expect things, to see the famous musician, the performance, the entity that appeared on television and on the cover of magazines. She had expected Michael Jackson the performer, the public presence, the thing that the industry had packaged and sold, and that she had been purchasing in the form of records and magazines since she was a teenager. What she saw in the parking lot was a 14-year-old boy, not a diminished version of the performer, not the performer caught off guard or behaving badly or being smaller than the mythology. Just a boy, a specific, individual, particular person, 14 years old, standing in a coat that was slightly too large for him, speaking with the specific quality of attention that some people have when they are actually listening to another person. Not performing listening, but doing it. He nodded at something the woman said. He responded with something Carol could not hear. He looked toward the venue entrance when someone called his name, and then he looked back at the woman and finished what he was saying before he went. He was not performing for the parking lot. He did not seem to be performing at all. This specific quality was also what Carol Whitfield was in the presence of in that parking lot, without having the language for it at the time. She was watching someone who was simultaneously one of the most famous 14-year-olds in America and a specific individual person standing in a coat in Ohio, having a real conversation with a stranger. The two things were not separate. They were the same person, doing two things at once, existing as the public entity the industry had made and as the private person underneath it. And the parking lot happened to be a place where, briefly, the private person was the one that was more visible. She showed the photograph for the first time publicly in 2009, a few weeks after Michael Jackson's death, on a community website where people were sharing memories. She wrote a brief note with it. She described the coat. She described the way he had turned back to finish what he was saying. She said, I had never seen someone be famous and be themselves at the same time before. I did not understand what I was seeing. I think I understand it better now. The photograph circulated briefly in the weeks after she posted it, shared on the kinds of pages where fans gathered to grieve and remember. Then the internet moved on, the way the internet moves on, and the photograph returned to the relative quiet it had lived in for 52 years. Carol Whitfield still has it. She is in her mid-70s now. She has been asked occasionally why she kept it, why a blurry, overexposed parking lot photograph was worth keeping for more than half a century. She says, because it's the real one. She means the other photographs show the performer. This one shows the person. The performer belonged to everyone. The person, standing in a parking lot in Cincinnati in 1972 in a coat that was slightly too large for him, turning back to finish a sentence before he went inside, that person Carol Whitfield saw for 5 minutes. That quality, the decision not to interrupt a 14-year-old boy having a genuine conversation in a parking lot, was what Carol Whitfield had been trying to protect for 52 years without quite knowing how to say it. She had witnessed something private in a public space, not a secret, not a scandal, just a person being themselves without the machinery of performance around them, in the specific brief window of time between the parking lot and the stage door, when there was no camera and no audience except for the small group that had gathered and were standing quietly at the edge of the moment, watching without interrupting. Michael Jackson walked into the venue that afternoon and performed for several thousand people. The concert was, by the accounts of the people who were there, extraordinary. The 5 brothers in full command of a crowd that had been waiting for them, Michael at the center, the performance that the industry had built and packaged and sold, delivered at full intensity. Carol Whitfield had 2 experiences of Michael Jackson that day. The concert, which was the one everyone talked about, and the parking lot, which was the one she kept. The concert was the product, the thing that the industry had built and that the audience had paid for and that delivered, with full force, everything that 40 million records and 2 years of television appearances had been promising. Michael Jackson at 14 on a concert stage was extraordinary. There was nothing ambiguous about that, nothing subtle. He was extraordinary, and the people in that arena knew it. And the experience of watching him was the experience of being in the presence of something that did not happen every night or every year, or perhaps every generation. The parking lot was different. The parking lot was not a product. Nobody had built it or paid for it or promoted it. It happened because Michael Jackson had walked out of a venue entrance on a cloudy afternoon and had been Michael Jackson, the specific 14-year-old person underneath the public phenomenon, for 5 minutes in a parking lot, while a small group of fans stood at a distance and watched without interrupting. She kept what she saw. Some things are worth keeping. What Carol Whitfield understood, slowly over the decades, was something that most of the world spent a long time learning, and some of it never quite arrived at. That the version of Michael Jackson that mattered, not commercially, not historically, but in the specific human sense, was not the phenomenon. It was the 14-year-old in the coat, the performer who turned back to finish a sentence before he left, the person who, in the space between the parking lot and the stage door, was briefly just a person. The phenomenon belonged to the century. The parking lot belonged to Carol Whitfield and to the few other people who had been standing quietly at the edge of it, and to Michael Jackson himself, the one who had been the boy in the coat, before the coat was too small and the world was too large, and the two things became impossible to hold together at the same time. She still has the photograph. It is still slightly overexposed. He is still slightly off-center in the frame. The Ohio sky is still gray. She does not need it to remember. She would remember without it. But she keeps it anyway, because it is the real one, the one that shows not what Michael Jackson became, but what he was on a cloudy afternoon in 1972, before all of the becoming happened.